it's not just simply that Israel is battering Gaza as an act of revenge. There's a fight going on, and while that fight continues, that one reason for the distress of the population that gets caught up in it. So it takes two to bring this to an end. The problem is those two won't talk to each other now.
Story this afternoon. The UN Security Council is meeting in New York ahead of a vote on a resolution calling for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire in Gaza. Meanwhile, the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken says the IDF need to wrap up their ground operation in Gaza in a month, despite Joe Biden's continued support for Israel. Sir Lawrence Freedman is a professor of war studies at King's College in London and joins me now. Good afternoon, Sir Lawrence.
I mean,
when you hear what Antony Blinken said, there's a gap, he said, between Israel's intent to protect civilians compared with how the war is now unfolding. Do you think the US is losing patience?
I think it lost patience some time ago, but there's limits on what it can do. The problem is Israel hasn't completed all its military objectives. If it stopped now, Hamas would have been badly hurt, but by no means out of the picture as the Israeli government wanted. Yet at the same time, the humanitarian situation has been, it's not a new deterioration, it's been deteriorating solidly. It recovered a bit during the truce that allowed hostages to be released, but that ended. And now it's getting much worse again as Israel moves into the south. So there's an inherent tension here between Israel's military need to keep going and the humanitarian need to provide some relief. A lot of relief is needed for the civilians.
It's suggested that January is the kind of cut-off point for the US, but the way things are going, what will be left of Gaza by then?
Well, Gaza's already been battered. I think there's two issues. There's a short-term issue of providing relief. That's quite urgent. I think Israel is letting in more, but it's not simple just in terms of the practicalities, when you never quite know where the fighting is going to be next. And then there's a long-term issue of the reconstruction of Gaza, which is possible, but it will take time and money. And in my view, can't be done with Hamas in charge because Hamas has got other priorities and couldn't cope. So I think the other part of the problem we're facing here, which is one that is exercising the Americans quite a bit, is how do you think about the aftermath?
Well,
what is it that you do to make long-term reconstruction possible?
Well, what's your answer to that question? Because, the UK seems to be pinning its hopes on the Palestinian Authority, but is that viable or not? Or is there some other kind of third way solution that might work?
Well, it's hard to do it without the Palestinian Authority because they're the only Palestinian group other than Hamas with some sort of constitutional role. But nobody believes at the moment that it's in a fit state to do so by itself, or that has great authority amongst Palestinians because it's seen as corrupt and ineffectual and so on. So I think you can see all the conversations moving in this direction, is you're going to need some sort of consortium, some arrangement for governance, some role for the major Arab states, all of whom have, or most of whom have relations with Israel now. So you could see how that could work, but getting there, because you're talking about things that would be difficult and potentially hazardous, is another matter. And it's hard really to get people focused on that while the fighting is ongoing and the humanitarian situation deteriorates daily.
Well, I suppose that, the UN Secretary General is calling for a humanitarian ceasefire. It's kind of hard to ignore those calls, isn't it, when you look at the devastation and the number of civilian casualties?
It's an unusual move from the Secretary General. I mean, Guterres is a more activist Secretary General than others. He has been on Ukraine as well. He's pressed this to a vote. And remember, the UN are the major agencies who are trying to cope in Gaza. And as the Secretary General pointed out, they've lost a lot of people in the process. So for him, this is undoubtedly an urgent matter. He's clearly getting pushback now. The French have asked for a delay. The Americans are clearly not happy. At some point, they know this will be an irresistible call, but they don't think it's going to happen yet. and they don't particularly like being put on the spot in this way. But it indicates the pressure that's building up, which Anthony Blinken is clearly well aware of in terms of the pressure he's then trying to pass on to the Israelis. But the Israelis are not in a mood to stop in the moment, and they spend all their wars. This isn't unusual, knowing that a ceasefire is coming and trying to get as much as done as possible before it comes down.
You talk about the Secretary General there being a sort of activist Secretary General. I mean, he's invoked Article 99 of the Charter, which
Yeah,
hasn't been done in decades, allowing him
yeah.
to debate any matter which might threaten peace and security. Do you think he's right to do that, or is there a risk entailed? And, you're talking about the pushback from other nations. Does he risk sort of undermining the UN more long term?
It's a risk. I mean, look, the UN is not in a great state anyway. It can't get much done on the Security Council because Russia, China, two of the permanent members are going to disagree with three of the other permanent members, the US, UK, and France. So the UN's not in a great place. I think it. I think from his point of view, it puts the issue on the table. It's not going to lead to an immediate ceasefire. In that sense, it risks undermining credibility. But I think his view will probably be that he has to say something just to make sure that nobody thinks that the current situation is satisfactory or can be allowed to endure for that much longer.
Mm. I mean, the UN isn't alone in warning that failing to stop the carnage in Gaza will fuel cycles of violence. The bombing of civilians in Gaza risking generating a new generation of extremists. And with your history hat on, I mean, you've never got your history hat off, but this has happened over the decades and the centuries, hasn't it? It's easy to draw historical parallels, isn't it?
It is. Look, I mean, we have to remember that one of the reasons that this is happening is because Hamas, who's been in charge of Gaza since 2006, effectively in complete control since 2007, turned it into a military base, and a lot of those killed, a lot of are soldiers of Hamas. They're still lobbing rockets towards Tel Aviv, towards Israel. So it's not just simply that Israel is battering Gaza as an act of revenge. There's a fight going on, and while that fight continues, that one reason for the distress of the population that gets caught up in it. So it takes two to bring this to an end. The problem is those two won't talk to each other now.
Mm.
And that's why we're looking at these other arrangements, because in the past this would have been done as it was done with the hostages, by some sort of deal being arranged by the Qataris between Gaza, between the Hamas and the Israeli government. But that a long-term deal just isn't possible now.
Well, just finally, perhaps to end on a more hopeful note, I don't know whether it's possible, but if you look back at other military conflicts in history, and other areas where it seemed that there would be no solution and the two sides could never agree. I mean, I don't know, going back in fairly recent history, the Good Friday Agreement, for example. I mean, is there any hope you can draw from other examples in history that might give us some sort of hope for the future?
The conflicts did come to an end. I was recently in Vietnam, which is sort of the conflict I grew up with, which is now a unified state doing pretty well economically, and has healed a lot of the divisions of the past. I mentioned the Good Friday Agreement. It is possible. And the problem with the Middle East, the infuriating thing about the Middle East, is there's no difficulty in working out what the compromise peace might look like. How you could manage this. The difficulty is always in getting there. And I think that the severity of this crisis will concentrate minds in a way that past fights between Israel and Hamas, and there have been a number, have not concentrated minds, because this time you can't just go back to how it was before. Something much more radical is going to have to be done.
So, Lawrence Freedman, thank you very much for joining us, Professor of War Studies at King's College in London there.